Back in 2015, some truly shocking revelations were made by the British newspaper The Sun. 1 in 5 British Muslims had sympathy for jihadis. They supported people traveling to Syria to join the Islamic State. The intended implication of this article and the way that many people took it was very clear. There's something wrong with these people. There's something wrong with their culture, wrong with their community, and we should have a serious think about whether they are fit to live alongside us. Well, it turned out that The Sun was kind of lying with that headline. The question asked, which they misrepresented, was not whether Muslims supported jihadis or whether they supported people going to join ISIS. It was, rather, whether they have sympathy with young Muslims who leave the UK to join fighters in Syria. Now, there were many different groups fighting in Syria, so the question was non-specific. It wasn't asking them which group they had sympathy for people joining, it was just asking them if they had sympathy for people going to Syria at all. And not even like, what kind of sympathy was that? Like, was it empathy for them as people, or was it sympathy for the groups that they were joining? In short, the question was totally misrepresented to drum up hate against Muslims. There is a certain group of people, however, who do constantly produce very worrying poll results that are a lot worse than what that poll would indicate, even if we took the lies about it at their word. Polls of Israeli Jews. This video was made possible thanks to my supporters on Patreon and Ko-fi. If you like it and you'd like to see more like it, consider heading over there and supporting me yourself. When Israeli Jews were posed the question of whether they thought the Israeli military was using too much or too little firepower in the Gaza genocide, only 1.8% said they believed it was using too much firepower. So if you got a random, demographically representative selection of 100 of them, only 2 of them would be against what is happening in Gaza. For another example, there was another recent poll which found that 65% of Israeli Jews think that Israeli soldiers who rape Palestinians should not face criminal punishment. Israeli society is really possibly the most complicit society of any state of its kind in history. And this might come as a shock to some people, because a lot of people like to believe in this sort of happy excuse for Israelis, where they are simply indoctrinated by propaganda. You know, they are sort of presented as victims themselves. Victims of propaganda that has convinced them that doing bad things to other people for their own benefits is actually the right thing to do. But it's also just kind of not true. Israelis don't really need to be convinced by propaganda that what their state does to Palestinians is good for them. It's something that is just self-evidently obvious. If you are Jewish in Israel, you get massive privileges at the expense of Palestinians. Israelis have their own little pet stories to rationalize it, but they still nonetheless know that masses of Palestinians used to live where many of them live today. They very well know what their country has been doing to Palestinians throughout its entire existence. It's reported openly on the news like it's a good thing. A normal thing to do on Israeli TV is to interview some guy accused of a war crime and treat him like a hero to rousing applause. There is not the same level of disconnect between the general population and the crimes done in their name as there is in, say, the USA, for example. You know, the USA was colonized and Native American resistance was largely defeated a fairly long time ago at this point. It's something that is very easy to compartmentalize, just like it's very easy for them to sort of ignore or be ignorant of what the USA does to many millions of people all around the world in their name. It happens far away from them, and they can't really readily perceive of the benefits that might derive for them. This is not to absolve Americans or anything. I mean, contrary to popular narratives, for example, most Americans supported the Iraq War. But there is a clear difference between that and Israelis. You know, Israelis know fully well that if they ever want some nice, cheap real estate, the West Bank is always open to them. Go there, take some Palestinian land, get yourself a big yard. Allow me to play a clip here of an average Israeli talking about this like it's the most normal thing in the world.
So the only place you're going to get a house, if you want a house and you want your kids to be able to have green space and be able to run, is in the settlements. And that's the problem. So a lot of people buy there because it's good value for your money. And it's often the only place they can afford to live because it's cheap.
Every Israeli either served or knows people who served in their military, and very few of them offer any real resistance to completing their mandatory service, not because of the potential consequences if they don't do so, but rather because very, very few of them see anything wrong with it. Tel Aviv is about 60 to 70 kilometers away from Gaza. You can see and hear some of the explosions in Gaza from there. The Israeli media, from the news media to movies to series, even to video games, is full of the sort of narratives that Israelis simply love. Narratives that present them as the heroes and the Palestinians as this sort of innate evil. There's this narrative that is very popular among more center-aligned types, that the Israeli people are against Netanyahu, for example. He does not represent them. Netanyahu is the problem with Israel. It is nothing particular about Israeli society that is a problem. And this is a very interesting narrative to confront with the historical reality. It's as if Israel was all fine up until recently, as if it hasn't been doing what it's doing now all throughout its history. As if Netanyahu hasn't been voted in by the Israeli public repeatedly for 2 decades. And it's just simply not true. Allow me to cite a friend of the channel, Lonerbox here, who talked of his experience speaking to supposedly anti-Netanyahu protesters in Israel.
And people like Elon use the hostages as political pawns. The hostages' families are standing on the streets of Tel Aviv opposing the Netanyahu government, calling for a ceasefire, calling for a deal.
Hey, I was there.
Elon Levy.
By the way, Mehdi Hassan would fucking despise those people because, again, they want the hostages back. They're not against keeping up the fight against Hamas. All those protesters, those pro-peace protesters that I spoke to, they will all come to you and they'll say, like, yeah, Hamas uses human shields. Yeah, but of course we still have to fight them as well. Like, it's justified to take them out when they're hiding behind civilians, all this shit. Like, Mehdi Hassan would fucking hate these guys. Like, yeah, God.
Now, his motivation in presenting that was to legitimize the war, basically. Something that is very common among pro-Israel people and that I might eventually dedicate a whole video to. This narrative where anything is legitimized as long as a sufficient majority of Jewish people think that it's legitimate. So for him, the fact that Israelis support an Israeli genocide in Gaza makes that genocide okay. But what he really inadvertently did there is provide a bit of insight into the reality of things on the ground in Israel. People might be against Netanyahu, but it's really a technicality. The things that they disagree with him on are not really fundamentals of the Israeli state and of the Israeli project. It's not we're against Netanyahu because we don't want him to kill Palestinians. It's we're against Netanyahu because we think he goes about killing Palestinians the wrong way. It's Himmler versus Hitler, basically. And for that matter, a lot of the groups in Israel that are often presented as like pro-Palestinian resistance groups really are not that at all. Israel is unique in modern history for its lack of internal resistance, for its population being just totally okay with the things that are carried out by the state for their benefit, with this state victimizing an entire group of people for the benefit of their group of people. In South Africa, for example, there were many white South Africans who were against apartheid, who joined up with the movement for black rights, often putting themselves at intense risk in the process. They didn't make their own parallel groups just for them, as practically all of the groups in Israel, which are erroneously painted as pro-Palestinian, have done. Rather, they joined the black people's groups and said, "What do you need of us?" In Nazi Germany, there was not that much resistance, but there was still way more resistance than there is in Israel today, especially armed resistance. Because man, the only actual armed resistance to the Israeli government coming from Israelis in the country's entire history was from far-right Israelis who wanted them to kill more Palestinians. And then if we look at what there is in Israel today, you have some groups which are not really against the fundamental problems of Israel. Like, they are not against, for example, Israel being this state that is heavily concerned with maintaining a Jewish majority and based around the systemic dispossession of an entire other group of people. They don't really want to remedy that problem. You know, they don't want to give Palestinians any land back. They don't want to give them reparations. They don't want to tackle the problem at its roots, but they rather want to put a band-aid over it. These organizations claim to be pro-peace, without mentioning that the peace that they imagine is peace on slightly watered-down Israeli terms. A peace without justice nor restitution. So they will advocate against things that are like obviously indefensible, like the occupation of the West Bank, the settlement of the West Bank, stuff like that. But ask them, say, about the Palestinian right of return, and they're going to get very, very quiet. Ask them why most of them do not actually work with Palestinians at all. Ask them why, instead of crossing the border and going to join the Palestinians, they stay in Israel and offer token opposition only to its worst impulses, rather than advocating for the Palestinian cause on Palestinian terms. They won't really have an answer for you on that. There are, make no mistake, some Israelis, a very limited amount, who have taken that step, who have crossed over the border to effectively, by any reasonable measure, turn themselves into Palestinians. But these people number in the dozens. In all of Israel's history, they number in the dozens. I will bring up Jonathan Pollock, for example. He is an anarchist activist who spends a ton of time in the West Bank, effectively turning himself into a human shield against the Israeli military because, they don't want to kill an Israeli, even if he is an anarchist Israeli. But that's one guy. I've studied Israel-Palestine for an absurdly long time, and that he is the only one who comes to my mind immediately is a damning denouncement of the lack of internal resistance to Israel. And this is very revealing about the nature of the Israeli state. It is a settler colonial project designed for the benefit of one people, Jews, at the expense of another, the people who were unfortunate enough to have been there in this piece of land that those people decided they have an exclusive right to, Palestinians. It is extremely obvious in Israel to Israelis precisely how and why they benefit from this. So when you think about it, this lack of real internal resistance makes a lot of sense. They're getting a pretty sweet deal out of things here. Why would they be against it? And given that they enjoy the unconditional support of most of the richest and most powerful countries in the world, there's not exactly any real pressure against them to force them to give this up. They know that they live in a country that used to be mostly populated by the people who are oppressed for their benefits today. They see very directly the sort of benefits that they derive from this. Most of them literally directly participate in oppressing these people themselves. There is a short story by Ursula Le Guin called Those Who Walk Away from Omelas about a society where everything seems great on the surface, yet in reality, all of this is only enabled through the endless torture of a child. And some, upon finding out about this, decide to run away. Israel is enabled through the endless torture of millions of children, adults, elderly. Those who benefit from it know about it for their entire lives, yet practically none of them walk away. There is no abstraction here. There is no compartmentalization. They know precisely what their country does, they know why it's done, and they know that it benefits them. And that's why they overwhelmingly support it. And that is why, in Israel, the right wing is a bunch of guys who think the West Bank should be annexed tomorrow, and the left wing is a bunch of guys who are only against that because they think that annexing it would mean that there would be too many Palestinians in Israel, which would then risk diluting the so-called Jewish character of the state. Even then, Israel is just totally unique in history. I studied American colonialism, for example, 19th century, full-on American frontier colonialism. I could still find quite a lot of cases of American colonists when they arrive at the frontier, realizing the reality of it, being disgusted by it, and then going and crossing over and finding the nearest Native American group who they could and saying, hey, can I please join you? This happened often enough that even Benjamin Franklin once complained about it. Yet the number of Israelis who have done anything resembling that throughout the entire history of Israel, you could count on one hand. And I want to note here that I was very generous in comparing British Muslims to Israeli Jews, rather than say British Muslims to British Jews. If we were to go that route, Israel's atrocities are usually supported by at least around 40% of Jews who live in other countries. Yet this is presented with this ridiculous double standard, where the fact that Jews think that Israel is good means that Israel is good, rather than applying the exact same standard to it that is applied to Muslims. It's apparently extremely worrying when a poll indicates that 20% of British Muslims support jihadists, yet it is not worrying when a poll indicates that, say, 45% of British Jews are totally okay with the Israeli military's treatment of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And speaking of sending foreign fighters to go and fight for an extremist group on the other side of the world, it's a completely normal thing in Israel supporting Jewish communities outside of Israel to encourage people to go and join the Israeli military, or even to literally invite Israeli military recruiters to their schools. Now, Western supremacists might argue that these are not the same thing. They might say, hey man, come on. ISIS did extraterritorial terrorist attacks in the West, for example. Israel hasn't done nearly as much of that. But that's not necessarily true. For one, attacks in the West are not magically worse than attacks elsewhere. And for two, Israel did go through a phase quite like that. Zionists, for example, engaged in a ton of terrorism against British targets, which they later stopped doing because the British, Americans, Europeans, etc. started to firmly support them. The only reason why there are no Israeli terrorist attacks all over the world is because Israel has support of all the powers that it needs support from. from the Americans, the British, the Australians, the Canadians, the Europeans. Instead, it saves its terrorist wrath for the Palestinians and for its neighbors, currently Lebanon. Israel is basically the answer to the question of what if ISIS existed and was fully accepted and supported by most of the world's most powerful countries. In fact, I think that is actually a generous comparison to Israel, because at least ISIS leaves open the possibility of conversion to its victims, while Israel has a more ethnically and racially charged basis for what it considers to be Jewish, which Palestinians are excluded from. I'd like to drop another final point here, which I think really lays bare the double standard between this demonization of Muslims and the acceptance of Israeli Jewish supremacist terrorism. Firstly, I want to make clear here that I do not accept this idea that Islamophobia is really a thing on its own. I believe that Islamophobia has nothing to do with the Islamic religion and everything to do with the fact that it is associated with third world colonized peoples, who are very often targets of imperialism. If you switch these religions around, if the first world was largely Muslim and the third world, or the Middle Eastern third world at least, largely Christian, the dynamic would instead be that Christianity was demonized. So Islamophobia, in my opinion, is, if anything, a euphemistic and more acceptable way to hate poor racialized people, because it gives them the out of saying, I'm not against the people, just the religion, when the reality is that they are also just as hateful of Arab Christians, of Arab atheists, of Arabs of any religion. That said, the primary victims of ISIS were not first world Christians. They were not Christians at all, in fact. It was not Jews. Hell, ISIS, coincidentally, has never ever launched any sort of significant attacks on Israeli targets. No, the primary victims of ISIS were other Muslims. And ISIS was primarily defeated by a ragtag coalition of very, very different forces. Among them were Christians, atheists, communists, whatever, but in the majority, most of them were Muslims. Muslims are the ones who shed blood to fight ISIS terrorists. Muslims are the ones who put in most of the real work to largely defeat the Islamic State. A lot of the time, when some extremist Islamist terrorist is planning an attack, you know why he ends up being found out? Because he's reported by other Muslims. Yet when a Jewish extremist terrorist wants to commit an attack, all that he needs to do is hop on a plane to Israel and join the military. And after he gets done helping out with the massacre, he can just hop on a plane, go back home, and continue with his life as if nothing ever happened. There is a fundamental issue here, a clearly hypocritical difference in perception based on nothing more than these people are perceived as the colonized, and these people are perceived as the allies of colonialism. And fundamentally, challenging this sort of perception has always been the direction of my channel. Because sadly, for most people in the West, there is really no such thing as morality, though they pretend that there is. They choose their positions rather based on who does what, not what they're doing. For the average Western politics YouTuber, when an apartment building in the Middle East is leveled by an American, a British, a French, or an Israeli bomb, that's little more than an opportunity for an interesting thought experiment about whether the attack was justified or not. The only time that they seem to find their humanity is when the inevitable reaction to actions like that reaches them and their allies. Hell, did you know that there are currently massive internment camps for women and children who are linked to ISIS, where many of them have been languishing for like a decade? This is pretty much never talked about, because the fact of the matter is that many, if not most, Westerners would not be against that at all if you described it to them. And their governments certainly aren't. Yet what would happen if we were to apply that exact same standard to, for example, believers in the Zionist ideology that causes Palestinians even more suffering than what ISIS caused to their victims? I bet you they would suddenly start throwing a tantrum. Anyway, yeah, that's all I wanted to say. See ya. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to my channel for more. And if you really liked it, consider heading over to my Patreon or Ko-fi and supporting me monetarily. Now I'd just like to thank all of my patrons, and especially my $25 plus patrons: Jel Cripson, Brosnan, Ace Malad, Robokami, Exos, Qualia, Mlog, Osman Malik, Tim Wilworth, Lucian, Jackagora, Yamakomat Yahabib, CW, Michelle Bagnall, The Son of Sandy, Falafel Stand, Geordie, and my $10 plus patrons: Christian Corniels, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Eric Macdens, Ugopnik, Nabiru, B, Johnny Rocket, Firefox42, Happy Nephron, Eric Perkins, Minijan, Ant, Max Halland, Jack Paul, Louise Bravo, Kieran Goodwin, Megan Lowndes, Soyborn, Comrade Nat Boulay, Clement Fadge, Hector Obregon, Asma B, Support Libraries, Jizdog, Cockle Badger, T Street, Aramis Goodspiel, Liam Rowe, Abza Rossi, Waldemir Dite, Bubbly T, Adrian Nisu, The Big L, Ibrahim Al-Shakawi, Mira, Atawin, and Hukulano. Thanks for watching, see you next time. This is me saying something random to put at the end because I want the video to last for exactly 20 minutes.